Years after Simba's triumphant return, a young lion cub stumbles upon a hidden cave in the Pride Lands, where he uncovers a terrifying secret about Mufasa's reign, a secret that reveals a far more brutal and sinister truth behind the Kimbunti, a Kimbodonti legend of the Great King. The Pride Lands were thriving under Simba's rule. The herds were plentiful, the waterholes were full, and the circle of life seemed to spin in perfect harmony. I was a young cub then, barely old enough to venture beyond the watchful eyes of my mother. I was fascinated by the stories of the past, particularly those of the great King Mufasa, Simba's father, whose legend echoed through every corner of our kingdom. He was portrayed as the epitome of a noble king, wise, just, and courageous. His reign was spoken of as a golden age, a time of peace and prosperity that had been tragically cut short by the treachery of his brother Scar. But there were whispers, faint and fleeting, that spoke of a different Mufasa. I first heard them from an old scarred lioness named Xena. She was a recluse, living on the fringes of the Pride, her eyes filled with a haunting sadness that seemed to go beyond the usual weariness of age. One day, while exploring near the edge of the Pride Lands, I stumbled upon Xena's den. Curiosity overriding caution, I peeked inside. She saw me, but instead of chasing me away, she simply stared at me, her gaze piercing. "You're curious about the old stories, aren't you, cub?" she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I nodded, unable to speak. "They tell you Mufasa was a saint," she continued, a strange glint in her eyes. "A perfect king. But they don't tell you everything." She then began to tell me stories that were not part of the official narrative, stories that had been deliberately suppressed, stories that painted a very different picture of the great Mufasa. Xena spoke of a hidden cave located in a remote canyon beyond the elephant graveyard, a place known as the Lion's Maw. It was said to be a place of ancient power, a place where Mufasa would go to make difficult decisions, decisions that required a certain ruthlessness. "The circle of life has a dark side, cub," Xena whispered, her voice barely audible, a side that Mufasa understood all too well, a side he embraced. She claimed that Mufasa, in his early years as king, had faced numerous challenges to his rule, not just from outside threats, but from within the Pride itself. There were lions who questioned his authority, who plotted against him, who sought to usurp his throne. According to Xena, Mufasa dealt with these threats in a way that was far from noble. He used the Lion's Maw as a place of judgment, a place of punishment, a place of no return. Those who opposed him, those who dared to challenge his rule, were taken to the cave, never to be seen again. "They say the screams could be heard for miles," Xena said, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. But no one dared to speak of it. No one dared to question the king. Xena's stories filled me with a sense of unease, a sense of dread. They contradicted everything I'd ever been told about Mufasa. Could the great king, the symbol of all that was good and just, have been capable of such brutality? Driven by a morbid curiosity, I decided to find the Lion's Maw. I had to see for myself if there was any truth to Xena's claims. The journey to the elephant graveyard was perilous enough. Hyenas still roamed those desolate lands, their haunting laughter echoing through the skeletal remains of long-dead giants. But beyond the graveyard lay an even more treacherous path, a narrow canyon shrouded in perpetual shadow. As I ventured deeper into the canyon, the air grew heavy, the silence oppressive. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. The walls of the canyon seemed to close in on me, and the shadows danced in my peripheral vision, taking on monstrous shapes. Finally, I found it. The Lion's Maw. It was a gaping chasm in the rock face, its entrance shaped like the open jaws of a Sinha, lion. A sense of profound dread washed over me as I stood before it, a feeling that I was trespassing on sacred and Bhayānaka, terrible, ground. Hesitantly, I entered the cave. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but as I moved deeper, I began to make out strange shapes on the walls. They were paintings, ancient and faded, depicting scenes of violence and bloodshed. Lions tearing each other apart, their eyes filled with a savage fury. And in the center of it all, a large, imposing lion with a magnificent mane. A lion that looked eerily similar to Mufasa. But this was not the noble king I knew from the stories. This was a different Mufasa, a Mufasa with eyes that burned with a cold, ruthless fire. A Mufasa who ruled not through wisdom and justice, but through fear and intimidation. As I continued deeper into the cave, I discovered something even more horrifying than the paintings. In a dark recess, hidden beneath a pile of rocks, I found them. Bones. They were lion bones, many of them, scattered across the floor of the cave. Some were old and brittle, others were more recent, still bearing the faint chinho, marks of teeth and claws. It was a scene of carnage, a testament to the brutality that had taken place within these walls. The truth, the terrible truth, began to dawn on me. Xena's stories were not just stories, they were real. Mufasa, the great and noble king, had been a tyrant, a ruthless dictator who had used the lion's maw to silence his opposition, to maintain his grip on power. He had not been the benevolent ruler the legend portrayed him to be. He had been a monster, hiding behind a facade of nobility. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a low growl that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness. It was a lion, old and scarred, but with a familiar regal bearing. It was Mufasa's spirit, trapped within the cave, forever bound to the site of his atrocities. But this was not the wise, benevolent spirit that had guided Simba. This was the other Mufasa, the dark Mufasa, the tyrant. "You shouldn't have come here, cub," Mufasa's spirit growled, his voice a chilling echo of the king I once revered. Some secrets are best left buried. I fled the lion's maw, the terrifying image of Mufasa's spirit burned into my mind. I ran until my lungs ached and my legs could carry me no further. I ran until I collapsed, exhausted and terrified, on the edge of the Pride Lands. I never told anyone what I found in the cave. I kept the secret to myself, a heavy burden on my young heart. But I could never look at Simba, or at the Pride Lands the same way again. The legend of Mufasa remained, the story of the noble king passed down from generation to generation. But I knew the truth. I knew the darkness that lay beneath the surface, the darkness that lurked within even the greatest of kings. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I can still hear the whispers from the lion's maw, the whispers of the forgotten victims, the whispers of the other Mufasa, the whispers that remind me that even in the circle of life, there is a place for shadows, for secrets, for the beast that lurks within us all, and that sometimes the greatest evil wears the mask of a hero.